will give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endures forever. Welcome back, friends, to Faith Matters with Phillip Campbell, Catholic variety program broadcasting on Good Shepherd Catholic Radio out here in lovely Jackson, Michigan. I am the aforementioned Phillip Campbell, your host, your traveling companion for the next half hour. Thank you, as always, for tuning in to the Faith Matters program. When we consider the Catholic tradition, obviously we look at the faith we have, the things we believe, the practices we engage in, for example, doing penance on Fridays or observing Advent or the different little Catholic cultural customs that have come down to us. That's one thing, but then you think even bigger than that, beyond that, you think of the art that the Catholic tradition has inspired, the architecture, the music, the development on Western civilization, or in any civilization that Catholicism has touched. It's truly vast. The Catholic tradition is a broad and deep river. And within that great river of Catholic tradition, there is a tremendous amount of diversity. The river branches off into distinct streams and rivulets, and they're all part of the same body of water. We're all part of the same church, worshiping the same God, the same Lord, the same Spirit, the same Eucharist, all flowing from the same source and leading to the same place. But still, within that great stream, there's all these interesting, distinct forms and characteristics. And some of these little streams are the various schools of thought and spiritualities that are associated with different figures in church history. So, for example, we might talk about Ignatian spirituality, and this is the body of spirituality that comes from St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. Very popular today is the so-called Little Way of St. Therese of Lisieux. The Little Way of St. Therese was a sort of spirituality for everyday common people that focused not on doing extraordinary things, but on doing ordinary things with great love. There's all these different types of theology. There's Augustinian theology. There is Thomism, the school of theology that traces its origin to the thinking of St. Thomas Aquinas. And then you have these different sort of spiritualities like Carmelite spirituality or Franciscan spirituality and so on. But today, I wanted to spend some time talking about probably one of the oldest and most influential forms of Catholic spirituality, and that is Benedictine spirituality. Benedictine spirituality is the spirituality that is associated with Saint Benedict of Nursia, who was a great abbot and saint of the 6th century, and the founder of the Benedictine order. Now, maybe you don't know much about Benedictine spirituality or Saint Benedict the man, but I can guarantee if you're Catholic, you have been touched by Benedict in one way or another. For example, have you ever heard of the phrase ora et labora? Ora et labora. This is Latin for prayer and work. Or have you ever prayed the divine office? Maybe you have the little book with the liturgy of the hours. Maybe you've ever been to a Vespers service. Have you ever worn the Benedictine cross? You might have seen these before. Gosh, it's hard to describe over the radio, but it's the little cross, the little crucifix with the circle, with the letters on it, and the little image of Saint Benedict. All of these things trace their origin back to Saint Benedict of Nursia and Benedictine spirituality. But even more so, every religious order in the West, or I should say almost every religious order in the West, traces its lineage back to Saint Benedict in one way or another. You look at these groups like the Carthusians, the Cistercians, the Trappists, all the various religious orders. So many of them go back to Saint Benedict, or started as reforms or branch-offs of Benedictine spirituality. Indeed, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the very form of Western monasticism as it developed in Western Europe was a creation of Saint Benedict. So the influence of this man and his spiritual vision simply can't be overstated. So I'm going to introduce the character of Saint Benedict, talk a little bit about his life, and then talk a little bit about the spirituality that he created and how he envisioned the Christian pursuit of holiness to unfold for the common person. Now, Saint Benedict was born in Italy around the year 480. To put this in perspective, this is only a few years after the Western Roman Empire fell. So he was born in the immediate generation after the fall of Rome at the very dawn of the Middle Ages. He was from a Christian family of noble parentage, and his parents decided to send him to Rome to study. Rome was still the center of education and scholarship in Italy, and so he was sent to Rome to study in a school for other noble boys, and he was accompanied by his nursemaid that he grew up with, who was supposed to keep an eye on him and make sure he attended to his studies. Benedict was an ideal student. He was intelligent, he was insightful, he was diligent in his studies, but he was very disheartened by the manner of living of his companions in school. What kind of manner of living? You can use your imagination. Imagine you're a young boy away from home in an all-boys school. You can imagine what that was like. Benedict found the frivolous lifestyle of his companions to be very empty, and it awakened in him an urge for deeper spiritual things. He'd always been a Christian, but he wanted to go deeper into his faith and really pursue God in a more radical manner. And so eventually he left school and fled to the countryside, taking his old nurse with him. And he went to a little town called Enfide, which is in the Italian countryside outside Rome, and lived there for a time. And it was here in Enfide that he worked his first miracle. His nurse had borrowed a wooden sieve from a neighbor for sifting flour, and she broke it through her own neglect, and she was extremely distraught over this. And the young Benedict picked up the pieces of the sieve, put them back together, and to the astonishment of the nurse, the sieve was made whole. Well, of course, news of this miraculous occurrence spread throughout the village of Enfide. Benedict got all sorts of attention that he did not want, and very soon he was compelled to flee to get away from the curiosity of the villagers. And this time he left his nurse behind. He had to abandon her in the village when she wasn't paying attention. Tradition doesn't say whether she ever found out where he went, but he left, and he went into the wilderness and found a mountain called Mount Subiaco. It was a very imposing mountain. It was full of crags and caves. It was surrounded by brambles. It was off the beaten path, and Benedict thought this was a great place to find solitude and to begin his religious profession. He quickly discovered there was other hermits living on the mountain. He met a old hermit named Romanos, who approved of Benedict's aspirations to live as a hermit on Subiaco, and he even showed Benedict a cave that he could use. The cave was extremely inaccessible. It was too difficult to regularly go in or out of, and so in order to sustain himself, Romanos had to periodically lower food and drink down on a rope, lower a basket down to the front of the cave for Benedict to eat. And so Benedict would spend 3 years there in the cave on Subiaco in solitude and prayer, developing his monastic vision. And despite his solitude, though, people people locally realized there was somebody living on Subiaco, they'd go by the road and they'd occasionally catch glimpses of Benedict at the mouth of the cave as his clothes over time turned to rags, as his hair grew ragged and unkempt, and he got a huge bushy beard. And the children of the area used to say there was some hideous monster living up on the mountain. But it was in the solitude of the cave of Subiaco that Benedict started to craft his spiritual vision and what would become the founding principles of the Benedictine order. Now, at this point, we must pause, and we have to discuss monasticism before Benedict's time, so we can appreciate the contributions he made. Monasticism in Christianity originally came out of the East. It started in Egypt in the 3rd century, and then Syria. It started with the Desert Fathers. These were Christian hermits who sought solitude in the desert. And monasticism in the East was characterized by solitude and harshness, by a focus on radical asceticism. So, for example, you will have characters like Saint Simeon the Stylite, who climbed on top of a pillar and lived there for 20 years. You'll have people like Saint Jerome living in a cave and using a rock for a pillow, or Saint Anthony, who is living out in the wilderness in an abandoned Roman fort in the Egyptian desert, exposed to all the elements and eating locusts and things like that. You have Saint Paul the Hermit, whose clothes wore away to tatters and clothed himself in a smock made of woven palm branches. Their fasts were rigorous. Their lifestyle was extremely harsh. They sought penance and mortification of the flesh. And because of this, they became spiritual masters. But nevertheless, their lifestyle in the early days was characterized by extreme harshness. Now, by the 4th century, the hermits were gathering together in little communities out in the desert under rules, but they were still very isolated. Essentially, you'd have communities of hermits living solitary but together. I don't know if that makes any sense, but imagine St. Anthony, for example. He would be dwelling on a certain hillside, and then around the hill there'd be all these little huts that hermits would live in by themselves, but still in proximity to their master, St. Anthony. Now, in the West, monasticism had no definite form at this time. St. Benedict, in his writings, noted that there were many types of monks in the West in his day. Some were solitaries living the life of a hermit, like Romanos. Some were living in monasteries, and some were more or less wandering vagabonds. Benedict describes them as religious bums who are just essentially wandering around, doing whatever they please at any given time under no rule. Now, the problem, as Benedict saw it, was that not everyone was cut out for the life of a hermit. Not everyone was cut out for living in a cave, using a rock for a pillow, extreme levels of fasting and mortification. That simply wasn't going to be in the capacity of every Christian to practice. But on the other hand, some of the less strict forms of monasticism did not help people to grow in holiness. So what Benedict thought was needed was something that could make authentic holiness attainable for the average person. Because the rigorous life of a desert father was going to be not only unappealing for most people, but unattainable. So he's looking for something that creates more balance, that can get you to holiness, but that is also attainable for the regular, average, common Christian. So it was with this in mind that Benedict composed his famous rule around 525. Now, after Benedict came out of the cave at Subiaco, he was approached by some hermits who asked him to come and be their abbot, that is, be their spiritual father, and govern them in a monastery. Benedict warned that their lifestyle would not be conducive to Benedict's governorship over them. He warned them he would be too harsh. They said, no, come on, come be our abbot. And they soon regretted the decision. They regretted it. They did not like the order and the structure that Benedict brought to their monastery, and quickly they tried to poison him. And the story goes that they gave Benedict a poisoned glass of wine at dinner time, and Benedict made the sign of the cross over the chalice, and it miraculously shattered in his hand, at which point he realized what the wicked monks had done and said, I told you this would not work and that I would be too strict for you. Why didn't you just ask me to leave? You didn't have to resort to poisoning me. And so he left to found monasteries of his own under a rule of life of his own construction, the rule of Saint Benedict, which was formulated in his years in solitude in Subiaco and first worked out in the monasteries that Benedict founded after 525. Now the rule, the Benedictine rule, was meant to give structure and balance to the pursuit of holiness, such that the average Christian could just yield himself up to the rule, and the lifestyle prescribed by the rule would form him as a hammer forging metal into the image of Christ. Now this was really the great genius of the rule. Instead of the average Christian having to make his own decisions about what he should be doing for a spiritual life, trying to figure out, should I fast this much? How much should I be praying? What should I be doing with my time? Instead of putting all that on the conscience of the Christian, the rule itself is structured to create these patterns of prayer, of penitence, and of physical labor that of just their very nature will form the Christian in the image of Christ and help him to grow in holiness. So someone living under the Benedictine rule, all they need to do is yield themselves up to the rule, and the rule itself will form that person, again, as a hammer forging metal. And that's the real genius of the rule. It helps the monk attain his spiritual aspirations, but also while being completely realistic about his physical limitations. The Benedictine rule doesn't have anything in it about fasting for 40 days straight, of sleeping outside in a cave in rags with your head on a rock for a pillow. There's nothing like that. It's very realistic about the common person's physical limitations. It recognizes that man is a composite being of body and soul, and hence the Benedictine motto, ora et labora, work and prayer, right? Work and prayer. Now, the labora, the work, corresponds to the body, the ora to the soul. So let's see how Benedict implemented this in his rule. The first thing he did was he divided the day up. He punctuated it by 8 hours of prayer, the canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, tierce, sext, nones, vespers, and compline. So 8 times a day, the monks are called to prayer. And this is an interesting way to do it. St. Paul says in the New Testament, pray without ceasing. Now, Benedict looked at that and said, well, that doesn't mean pray nonstop 24/7. That means every hour of the day, every part of the day should be sanctified by prayer. So the day is broken up into these periodic times for prayer that sanctify the different times of day. So the community would gather together in prayer. And in what did these prayers consist? It consisted in the chanting of the Psalter and other prayers. And Benedict had it structured in his rules that the whole Psalter was chanted through once every week. All 150 psalms would be gone through every week. And as you do this over the years, you get very intimately acquainted with the Psalter. The Psalms become the breath of life in your spirituality because you're praying through all 150 of them every single week for the rest of your life. Now, when the monks aren't praying, the rest of the 24-hour day was divided between manual labor and sleep. What kinds of labor did the monks engage in? All sorts, really. Farm work, stone working, the shearing of sheep, spinning of wool, kitchen work, anything really, because Benedict envisioned that the monastery should be self-sustaining. The monks should cultivate a life of self-sufficiency. They should be dependent on nobody for their sustenance but their own labors, and that their physical labors should be balanced with their spiritual labors. But not only was this necessary for self-sufficiency, but there was a spiritual reason as well. Benedict believed that that manual labor was the antidote to idleness, and idleness gave opening to the devil. So many sins that we commit because we're being idle and we have nothing else to do. And so that's when we start gossiping. That's when we start having bad thoughts. That's when we start lusting or committing all those various sins. If we stay busy with our hands, if we stay focused on our work, we don't give occasion for the devil. The old saying, idle hands are the devil's plaything. Now, part of the work of the monks was spiritual reading, private time, reading spiritual works for their own edification, but also copying spiritual works. The Benedictine Scriptorium was a very essential place in the monastery. This was the room where the monks would copy manuscripts, of course, in those days. There was no printing press, so if a book was to be copied, it had to be copied by hand. And many of the great works of antiquity have only come down to us today because throughout the Middle Ages, Benedictine monks copied these ancient works and passed them on to posterity. So that was a labor of love as well. That was a way of offering one's time and work to God. Meals were taken 3 times a day in community, but in silence, while the lector read from the Bible. So you would eat quietly. The only person speaking would be the lector, who would do readings from the Rule. So every single day you'd be hearing readings from the Benedictine Rule, and this was another way to internalize this manner of life. That's what the Benedictine Rule is all about, internalizing your habits of life, internalizing the Psalms, internalizing the daily schedule of prayer, so that just becomes a manner of living, so it just becomes the very cycle of life, just as natural to you as the cycle of day and night or the seasons is to the natural world. By the way, if you want to enter into the spirit of the Benedictine Rule, you can have something called a monk meal. I do this with my children periodically. It's where everybody eats in silence and one person does spiritual reading at the kitchen table. If anyone wants something, they have to gesture for it with their hands. There's no speaking, and then one person reads. And it's a very nice thing to institute if you want to get into the spirit of the Benedictine Rule, but also if you just need to find a mechanism to shut down the noise at your dinner table. It's excellent. So try having a monk meal sometimes. But the effect of all this is that the Rule and the prayers of the Psalter, the manner of living, the community, it all kind of coalesces together and just becomes the breath of life. The monks are effectively praying without ceasing. All times of the day are sanctified by prayer. So this is the idea behind the Benedictine Rule, Benedict's spirituality. He would go on to found 12 monasteries during his life that functioned on this rule. The most famous was Monte Cassino, which still exists to this day. Now, Benedict himself would die in the year 543, but the rule definitely did not pass with Benedict. The rule was such a admirable tool for forming monks in Catholic spirituality that it spread after Benedict's death, such that within a brief time after his death, Benedictine monasticism had spread throughout Italy, and then within a few generations, it was all over. It was all over Europe. You have in the year 597, which is just about 150 years after Benedict died, it's being introduced in places far away as England and just all over the place. So it was extremely, extremely popular. It would be very fruitful and spread all over Europe. Thousands and thousands and thousands of Benedictine monasteries within a few centuries of Benedict's death. Incidentally, by the way, the mechanical clock, the invention of the mechanical clock, was also due to the influence of the Benedictine Rule, because the Benedictines would meet 8 times a day to pray. Sometimes you'd always have monks out in the fields, right? So the monks looked for a way to notify the monks out in the fields that it was time for their daily prayers. So they needed some mechanism for keeping time that would be able to, ding a bell or make a noise that would call everybody on the monastic grounds to prayer at the same time. And sometime in the High Middle Ages, we don't know when. Some people say it was in the 900s. Some people place it a little later. But mechanical clocks started appearing in Benedictine abbeys around Europe. and they were there for the purpose of keeping the canonical hours, for dinging a bell at the time for Vespers so that monks out in the fields would know, hey, it's time for me to drop my work and start my prayers. And since these clocks were so helpful, the secular communities, the villages that lived around the monasteries, started keeping their day by the clocks as well. And then eventually the clock moved from being primarily a monastic tool. It moved into secular buildings like city halls and places like that by the latter Middle Ages. So whenever you see a mechanical clock or a clock tower, this is a direct kind of descent from the original Benedictine abbeys, where these bells were tolling the canonical hours to call the monks to prayer. Benedictine spirituality always promoted spiritual growth through a very steady, balanced regulation of man's physical and spiritual life under the firm but very gentle guidance of the rule. And that explains the perennial popularity of the Benedictine rule, why to this day, almost 1,500 years after Benedict's death, Catholic men and women all over the world are still eagerly embracing Benedictine spirituality, studying the rule, praying the Liturgy of the Hours, wearing the Benedictine cross, adopting Ora et Labora as their own motto for their own spiritual life. So, if this is your first introduction to the life and spirituality of St. Benedict, I do encourage you to read more about him, to read more about his rule, and to learn about Benedictine spirituality. I think you will find it very helpful if you are just a common person, because that's who Benedict had in mind when he created all this stuff, right? Well, that's about all the time we have today. I'm so glad that you tuned in. Until next time, this has been Faith Matters with Phillip Campbell. May the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. God bless you.